Alright, so this is the bar stool. This is a type of object that it probably has some metal. I'm assuming, Catherine, this is supposed to be metal. So when you're dealing with metallic surfaces, a lot of what we're seeing is a reflection, right? When you're looking at metals, a lot of it is reflection. That's going to be kind of hard for you to do in this course because you can obviously have an asset that has metal parts, but it's going to be difficult for you to make it look convincing. Because in order to make convincing renders, having metal look like metal, what you don't want to do is just go and search for, oh, I need a metal, so I'll do metal texture. And then you'll find something that kind of looks like metal, and then you'd apply this, and it looks great. But it doesn't look great because all of what you're seeing here is this. Imagine if you rotate around the object. This will all be baked down into the texture. You won't see the updating reflection. So in order to have successful renders of metal, we really need a reflective environment. And then we start talking more about rendering and all of that. So it's a little bit beyond the scope of this class. What you need to be focusing on is purely textures. Okay, so to make it simple, you can obviously have an asset with a lot of metal, that's fine. But all I'm saying is don't worry too much about what I don't want you to do is actually do what I'm saying here. Don't grab a texture like this and slap it on there and make it look more or less like metal. It's not, you don't want to do that. So it's easier, of course, to focus on surfaces that are more diffuse, kind of like woods or plastics or rubber or any kind of dielectric materials. But yeah. So for this, I don't know, this cushion pillow thing, that could be, that we can sort of imagine that's not really reflective, so that's more diffuse. All right. So in order to show some texturing in this class, you do need to probably think about this. Because if you have only pure surfaces, so let's say you have Wall-E, like the character from the Pixar movie, or some like really shiny, smooth, one-color surfaces that don't really require a lot of texturing, that's okay. There are a lot of cases that you would have that. But in order to show some texturing, you still need to, you know what I'm saying. So you don't want to just deliver files without any form of diffuse texturing. So that's why I'm having you do the kitchen, because it's kind of a, there's a lot of potential to show some texture work, right? Depending on the kitchen. But again, there probably will be some wooden surfaces. There probably, get what I'm saying? Okay. So don't worry too much about reflective surfaces for now, because that's really, we're going to talk, we have to address more rendering, having more of an environment. But what we need to do right now is just to understand this, and sort of what you've been working with is making UVs. And we're just going to now make sure that we sort of grasp, okay, so how do we take this into Photoshop? And we've sort of done this briefly before when we talked about UVs. But let's see if we can't make a brief and quick color map for this asset. So the first thing is obviously you go to the UV map or UV editor. Make sure, so all the checklists that we went over. So this is looking good. Seems like it's all kind of optimized within the 0 to 1 quadrant, and it doesn't seem like we have overlapping UVs. All of this stuff we talked about last time. And the solution for this chair or this stool, even though it's several meshes, you can see that. And again, there's no reason to build everything in one mesh. Like if it consists of several meshes, if it would be constructed that way in reality, it's better and preferable to actually build it that way also in CG. It's easier and technically better, right? So you're just making it hard for yourself if you're modeling everything from one mesh. So now it seems like everything is connected, but that's just because you've combined it. So I can go here and mesh separate even if I wanted to. You don't even have to combine it. Now they're separate meshes. So that makes it a little confusing because if I select this, those are the only UVs I'm seeing. If I select that, those are the only UVs I'm seeing. But then if I select all of them, I will see all the UVs. So you don't necessarily even have to combine it. You can just keep the meshes separate. And then, I mean, I personally prefer that. And then I have them in there. They're in a group. Then I would just delete history. Because now I can just quickly select all the different meshes. So how do we stay organized with this? You can make it in a group, but the way to do this is just to create a material for this. So we're going to open the Hypershade. So window rendering editors, Hypershade. So we're going to be using a material called Blinn. It's named after a guy called Jim Blinn. I think I mentioned this. We will get around to watching some movies here, and there's a movie called The Pixar Story. It's very nice. It tells the story of Pixar Animation Studios. A lot of those people were researchers at Utah University in the 70s. Jim Blinn being one of them, sort of the pioneers of CG, right? So you should at least have some basic knowledge of the history of CG. Anyways, so this material has just been here forever in Maya. It's old school, but it's pretty great for our purposes right now, right? Because it's going to give us a nice update to what we're doing. So I want just one single material for this entire asset. So I created the Blinn. One way of adding the material to objects, I can middle mouse button click and drag. So if I start clicking and dragging down, it will assign this material to all the objects. Another way to assign it is just to select all the objects that I want to have that material assigned to, and then right click and hold and assign material to selection. So then if I now want to see, okay, so what's actually in this material, I can right click and hold and select objects with material. That will select the chair. Oh, you already had a material in there for the chair. Okay. So I made a new Blinn, assign it to the chair. Let me delete this one then. Select object with material, I can see everything that's in there. And that, of course, will select it so that the UVs will show again. So if I have several, this is how I'm going to quickly, it doesn't matter like how many objects are in the asset. It doesn't really matter. All that matters in the end is how many materials do we have. Right? So this material, I can see that it's only for the chair. Okay, so I'm just going to, this is going to be the chair material, right? So I'm just going to, I can double click it, and then it'll open up here in the attribute editor, and I can rename it like chair underscore mat, for instance, like chair material. So if we take a look at the Blinn, okay, so that's that. If we create a, let me just quickly create a sphere. And I can, another way to assign materials, you can actually right click and hold over any object and then go down here, assign existing material. And I can even assign that Blinn to another material, but it's not going to have, the material doesn't know where it belongs. I can obviously assign it to wherever I want. But just to explain sort of the way the Blinn works here, so you see the Blinn shader. It has some common material attributes. So we have a color map. So this is the only attribute that we're going to be assigning something to today. We're just going to be making a simple color map. That's obviously the color of the surface color. But then we have also transparency, so we can make the object transparent. And again, like reflective surfaces and also refractive surfaces. Refractive being glass, for instance, light passing through objects and bending, light rays passing through an object and bending, that's what we call refraction. That's also something that's a little bit more complicated and beyond the scope of this class. I'm just saying this so that if you're making any kind of transparent glass surfaces or reflective surfaces, don't spend too much time on the rendering aspect in this class because it's not a part of the class, really. We're just doing texturing. It's basic texturing, right? Just to underline that point again. But next time we will look a little bit more at how you can actually make some custom transparency maps and things like that if you want to have semi-transparent surfaces like very simple glass, for instance, where there will be no refraction, but we'll still have partial transparency and things like that. So this will all become very clear to you. You know, it looks daunting, and there's a lot of buttons to push, but they all work the same way. And the beauty of this is that now we have the UVs laid out, and we're going to be able to attach file nodes to any of these attributes to control the parameters based on textures. You know, that's the whole point of what we're doing. So if we're controlling the transparency using a texture, we'll call it the transparency map. We can do a bump map. We can do, you know, all of this. All right. Then down here, there's another tab called specular shading. So specular shading, that doesn't have to do with the color, but it has to do with, you see that, the reflection in there. So I said we wouldn't worry about the reflection, but we will worry about it insofar as we'll make sure to differentiate the specular reflection, that specular highlight that you're seeing right there. So you see that it has a little specular highlight, and we're going to be able to, you know, let's say you're making whatever type of surface. You can imagine that the actual the highlights will differ depending on if it's dirty in areas or if it's more shiny, right? It's pretty simple to grasp. So that's what we're going to be. We will be doing that next time. So based on your color map, we're also then going to be able to go in here and literally just attach a map to where it says specular color. That's we're going to call that a spec map, and that's going to be used to differentiate and make variation in the specular highlight. So that's really it you have to worry about right now. But for today then, like I said, all we're going to be doing is changing the color here and see if we can make sense of how this works going from here into Maya. So now, or to Photoshop. So that becomes pretty important though to really work structured. Make sure you work in the Maya project because now we will be making files, and the files all need to be associated with the project, and Maya needs to read the correct texture path. So if you're not already in the habit, but I think you all are at this point, make sure you're working in Maya projects. So now I'm going to make a Maya project for this. So I'm just going to put this locally on this computer. Yeah, so let's just, first of all, I want to check the UVs here with the checkerboard again. So let's see. 17. Oh, okay. Got the wrong path there. Alright, so let me grab the the checkerboard. I think I had a checkerboard here. Here, checker pattern. Let me throw that on the server there if you don't have it. So I'm just going to dump the checkerboard pattern that I'm using in the same path here. So if you want to use it, if you don't have it, and I'm going to make sure copy that and put it in the source images directory. So all the texture files that you'll connect to any material in Maya, ideally that should always be placed in the source images directory. That's the correct path. So then, first of all, let's just quickly, in this material that I call chair mat, double click that, and then in the color attribute on the top, this is where I'm going to click to attach something, and in this case we want to attach a file node. So that, there are some other checker patterns in here and different options for creating procedurally generated textures, but right now we want to be using file nodes. So I can in the hypershade I can select the material, just click it once, and then this button right here is to show the input connections. If I click that, whoops, it's going to graph this material in the work area down here. All right, so I select material and I click here, show input connections. So here we can see that now there's something going into this material. This is the material. This is the file node that I just created. And this is a place 2D texture node. So the place 2D texture node helps decide the placement of the textures. Let's get back to that in a little bit, but we can repeat the UVs, which is useful for tileable textures. So let's talk about that in a little bit. But for now, we're dealing with this asset, which is a chair. It has a finished UV layout, so we don't have to touch the place 2D texture node. Just go to the file node, and then we go grab the file that you need. So in this case, just grab the checker pattern. And then I briefly mentioned this before. This is the filter type. For the most part, I'm just going to turn that off. This is in animation. It can be useful. This is to help prevent flickering in your textures and so forth. But it just adds a little bit of a blur on the texture, and I don't want that right now. So I'm just going to turn that off. So I'm in my viewport, and I can press 6. That will show the texture. So this is looking very good. Like this is exactly what you want to see. So you can see that there's no stretching. You can see that all the little checkerboards are actually little checkerboards. They're not. There's a minimal UV stretch texture stretching in this texture distortion. So, and if some areas were stretched, let me see, what is this? Probably. You see now, even if you're seeing something like that, where it's more elongated, it's not really okay. Or obviously, if you have some stretching like going on. So this is looking good, and also the texel density is very even. The texel density is the actual, the practical resolution on the objects themselves, right? So we can see that all these checkerboards match, like they're pretty much the same size. So that means that even though this asset has several objects, the entire asset has a similar texel density. That's all that means. Again, we can try to provoke an error. So if you see something like that, you can say, okay, these checkerboards are obviously now larger than these. Very quick to see that no longer is there an even texel density. So this is looking very good, right? Technically, very good. So I can select all the pieces. Oh, and one other point. Yeah, so in all areas where you don't really see the polys, you can just get rid of them like is done here. So that's just being tucked up here, and then you can just delete all the polys that you don't actually see. I mean, technically nothing will happen if you don't delete them, but it's just that we don't need them, you might as well delete them. Unless you're building the asset so that it could be destroyed, let's say in a video game or something. If you shoot at it, then this, or in a simulation or whatever, then of course you need to build it so that we can actually break it apart. Okay, so let's now just export this UV layout again. So I'm selecting all the pieces and I go image, at the bottom UV snapshot. And then it's going to go to the path called images. It's going to name it out UV. And I can just set a resolution for this. I'm just going to set it at 2K, 2048 by 2048. Remember to change the image format. So we're going to do a JPEG. And okay, so it's going to sample from 0 to 1. That's what we want. And then hit OK. Now we should be able to find that in the images right here. And we can open that in Photoshop. Let's see. All right, so any questions about this so far? So far, so good. So it's not going to be very technical now, really. I mean, maybe if you have very little experience in Photoshop, it's going to be also another software to learn. But Photoshop is so useful for just in general, I'd say, any sort of media you're doing. So you should really. It's a nice opportunity to learn it, anyways. But let's see. Just open that. Okay, so there we're looking at. I'm just going to comment everything I do. Okay, so if I press Z, the Z button for zoom, I can click once to zoom in or hold Alt to zoom out. I can also click down here in that icon. Now I'm zooming in and out in the document. So if you take a look at the bottom left corner, that will say the percentage at which you're observing the document. So right now it's at 50%. If I click once, it will be at 33.33%. And when you have these kind of percentages, it's kind of strange, right? You can see that, well, I don't know if you can see it very well, but the pixels are not displaying perfectly. It's this little Photoshop thing. So I recommend when you're zooming in and out, make sure that you land at like whole numbers. So like 25% or 50% or 100%. It's just displaying the pixels more nicely. Okay, so another kind of neat trick here is you press F. That's actually to alter between different modes of viewing the canvas. So press F once and I hold spacebar. I can just move the canvas around, which is very, very useful. So when you're working, I'm moving the canvas around. It's just very nice being able to do that. If you press F once again, you're in full screen mode. So you can press F like 3 times to toggle between the different modes. This is the standard document mode. Oh, I guess I can. Okay, yeah, okay. This is just to go inside the document. But I can still hold spacebar and move it around, so maybe that's okay. And initially you'll see the layer here is locked. That's just the way Photoshop does this. The initial layer is locked. We can't make any changes to this layer. In this case, I don't really want to make any changes to it anyways, but to unlock it, a quick way to do that is to just double click and name it something. I'm going to call it UV. Now you can see that layer is unlocked. Now it's just a normal layer. I'm not going to be touching it anyway, so I'm just going to lock it back, which is this icon. I can just click there, and now it's locked again. So I can't really change it. Okay. So And then you start looking for texture reference. So I don't know if you already went here to textures.com, but that's just one example of a texture library. But there's some neat things in here. You can make a free account and you'll get some free credits, which you'll spend pretty quickly. But if you're nice with each other, you can sort of make a common texture reference library, maybe in your work folder or something. And it's always nice to be nice. And then you can share textures, so whenever you download something, don't just keep it to yourself. Maybe you'll do that. Just on the server, if you make a folder there called textures or something in your work area. I do have some I don't have a lot of textures in here, I think. Let's see what I have. If you go to my yeah. There we go. So teaching, jewels, resources, textures. I have something in here. It's not a lot. Oh yeah, it's quite. I have something in here. Wood. Okay. So when you start looking for texture reference, what you don't want, or essentially what you want to try to avoid, is these are all looking pretty good. But if you just do a Google search or something, a lot of times you'll find textures that have a lot of highlights in them or a lot of shadows. So for the most part, we want to try to avoid that, because the shadows and the highlights and all of that, that's going to be rendered by our 3D render, right? We don't want that baked down into the texture. Just like I was saying, you don't want to just search for metal and have some sort of reflective texture and slap it on there. That's never going to look good. All kind of reflections and all of that needs to be handled by the renderer, right? So what we're looking for is technically just really diffuse kind of colors without too much shadows. So they're looking kind of dull, right? They're looking pretty, not too exciting, but really that's what you want. You don't want too much going on there. So you're just looking for the base texture. And sometimes, like, if whatever it is that you're texturing, if you're texturing a wooden chair, you don't have to look for textures for a wooden chair. You would just find some sort of wooden texture that would serve as the base for the texturing. And that's just a general tip. Like, whenever whatever it is that you're texturing, you don't have to necessarily try to look for that specific asset or that specific object. So I don't know if we had some pillow something in here. Or okay, I don't know what cloth. Leather, maybe it's leather, right? Leather would also be kind of a little bit reflective, but that's fine. We also have some. Okay, yeah, so that could be nice. Let's just try that. So yeah, so leather. Yeah, it would be leather, right? You're right. So then you could say, well, it's just going to be just a one color, nice, smooth leather. I don't need a texture on there. Yes, you can always make that. That could always be the case. But for this assignment and for what you're delivering, you have to make sure that you set yourself some challenges so that you can show that you're texturing a little bit. Right? So in this case, I would actually go in here and try to find some leather. So maybe it's, you can see this is, now we're starting to look at weathered surfaces. So weathering, making surfaces look more used, like look a little bit worn. So that could be, I think we'll have to look at some more references of but you know what I'm talking about. Like, you can make it look a little bit more believable if you add a little bit of weathering, a little bit of wear and tear, especially to surface areas or to contact areas, which would be the corners, for instance, of this places where the object has been exposed to friction. So you know, you have to do with some. So this is typically what you want to avoid, just baking down into your texture. I can use this texture as a base, right? It's a nice kind of base texture, but then I don't want to just place this highlight and bake that down into the texture. You know, that highlight should always be something that's done by the renderer, right? But let's look at this one. It's kind of nice, just as a base texture. Maybe we'll try this just for the sake of the demonstration. So you can see to download these larger files, I would need more credits, and you can buy a few credits, and then or there are other ways of obtaining these. Okay, so now I've downloaded that. I'm not gonna obviously attach this texture directly to the material. Now this is just for me to start working and see if this might work. So I can it doesn't matter where I put it. I can keep it somewhere else, or if I want to, I can put it in data or images. Anything that's final and will be attached to material should eventually be put in the source images. But for now, I can maybe just put it in images, and I have it right there. Control V, and I can paste it in there. It's just all my textures. So I can open that with Photoshop. So you see, it's kind of a rough texture. There's a lot of this little highlights. Okay. Let's see what else is in here, though. Maybe not so much the color, but we can always change the color. I'm just looking kind of for a pattern that might work. Maybe we'll try to download that. And open with. So now you don't. This now probably will be more. Texturing is more. It's definitely very time consuming. I'd say it's less technical, but it requires more time. Right? It's just you have to experiment a lot. There's no clear-cut solutions. But anyway, so okay, so I had the document open. I can hit Control A. That will select everything. Let me do that again. So I open the document. I can hit Control A. You can see that it will just make a marquee selection around everything. And then Control C, that will copy everything. And then Control W, that will close that document. And then Control V, and I'm pasting that into this document. Then I want that obviously underneath the UV layout, so I'm going to drag it under. Now the UV layout is obscuring it, but that's just because I haven't changed the blending mode. Well, in this case, I said I wouldn't change it, but I do need to unlock it to change the blend mode. So just click there, and then change the blending mode. In this case, you can see if I set it to screen, that's going to just make the black disappear, and the only thing that we're seeing are the white lines. That's all I want. There we go. So there we have the layout. And if I want to make sense of this, like what I'm looking at, I can go back to Maya. I can say, okay, so where are the pillows? Like in this case, I can just click it and select. Next, there they are. Those are the pillow pieces in the layout. Okay, great. I'm back to Photoshop. Fine. So let's just do this very quickly now, just to make sure that this works. We'll just start making use of this texture. So Control T, I can rotate it, translate it around. And if I hold Shift, I can snap to increments. You can just rotate it like that, place it in there, and just decide on the scale of this. I don't really like this texture too much. Looking more closely at it, but let's just try this. Put it in there. So what you want to be a little bit careful with when you're scaling is that if you go like this and let me make a copy of this layer by clicking it down here and just dragging it to the new layer icon, that will just copy the layer. If I click V, I can access the move tool to move it around. So what you want to be a little bit mindful of when you're scaling is that you don't want to do this. So I'm going to scale it, and then I can hold Shift. That's to scale uniformly without breaking the aspect of the image. But if I go down, I scale it down, and then that's a little too small, and then I scale it back up. I can't really do that because I'm going to lose resolution, right? So if you scale it down, it's going to be baked down to those pixels. So when you scale it back up, now that's no good. Okay. So let me just copy this again and move it around. Make sure to fill the pillow area with this. Let me show you a little tip here. Well, there are several ways of doing everything, but if I just want to continue this pattern over here, I can just make a copy of this layer. And I'll drag that layer up here. And now I have a very visible gap. Or maybe it's not so visible. A little bit. But then I can go over and, so I don't have my my Wacom pen here attached, but that's fine. But I can go over and see that it's not perfect, but I can erase some of this. If I'm a little bit careful at it, I can pretty much get rid of that seam. That's one way of doing that. So let's see, if I go over with a little bit larger. So if I spend some time at this, I can make that transition pretty successful. So I don't want that harsh line, but I want to make this transition sort of just blend into the other. So that's what I'm saying, like these processes in Photoshop is probably going to be a little bit more time consuming. It takes time to make this start looking good. But anyways, not so technical perhaps, but more just applying a lot of time. Okay, and then so I end up with some layers. If I want to merge layers, I can shift click and just select more layers. So let's say I want to merge all these 3 layers that I've got. So I select all the 3 layers and Control E, that will just merge it back. Now I have one single layer. And then I can copy that and move it over here for this piece. Something like that. Okay. And then just remove it from where I don't want that pattern. So okay, so I'm using the lasso tool here. It's also a polygonal lasso tool. Polygonal lasso, you can just click and make points, and it's to make a selection marquee or a selection. And there, and I can just delete that. So now I have that selection. So in Photoshop, to unselect or deselect, you can hit Control D. So I just want to get rid of all of this where I don't want that pattern or that texture. And there we go. So let me just now, I will save this document. I'm going to save the PSD document. That's the Photoshop document. That's where I'm going to be doing all the texturing for that asset. So I like saving it in source images. I'm going to call this chair, and that's it, just chair, because this will include all the layers. This will just be a Photoshop document where I do all the texturing. I'm not going to attach that Photoshop document to the material, right? I will be exporting other maps, or like PNGs or JPEGs or Targas or TIFFs, and those will be the image files that will be connected directly to the material. But I still like saving it in the source image directory, because every time I hit save, Photoshop is just going to automatically go to that directory, and I can save files in there. So okay, save, and okay. So now that's done. And then to save out now the color map, I need to uncheck. So I'm hiding the UV layout. And let's just fill I'll just make a new layer and drag it to the bottom and just fill it with some a gray color. So I can click here, hold. If you right click and just hold, you can see that there are more options to these tools. So we have the gradient tool, here we also have the paint bucket tool. So I can just fill that. And I'm going to save again. It's going to save the PSD document. And I'm also going to save as. And in this case, let's just do a quick PNG. Yeah, so I've mentioned this previously. So PNGs and JPEGs are used a lot. PNG is just a newer format. They're both pretty good at compressing, or very, very good at compressing files without humans being able to detect it so much. So obviously, you can use PNGs. What you have to be careful with when you're using PNGs or JPEGs is that you're not opening that same PNG, making changes to it, and then saving out another PNG. Because then you're introducing generational loss per save, right? But we're not doing that. We're always going to be opening the Photoshop file and then writing out new PNGs. So then you're not introducing that same compression several times. So that's totally fine. So chair and underscore color, that will be the color map. And it's also going to be, see here, it goes directly to that path. So it's just very nice to do it this way. And hit save. And PNG options. Okay. There we go. And go. Okay, so one other thing you have to be a little bit mindful of when you're saving PNGs is that because PNG can also hold an alpha channel. So if you have like transparent areas, make sure that you're not saving necessarily the alpha channel to go with it. Yeah, we'll look at that. So, but anyway, so let me just go to Maya. Now I need to find the material, so I can right click and hold material attributes, or if you have two monitors, which you do, you probably have the hypershade on the other monitor, so you have everything right there. And there's the file node. And now I just want to replace the checker patterns. I'm just going to go here and find the chair color PNG. And open. And let's look at the chair. Press number 6. So there you go. Beautiful. So, but you can see that obviously like what you're seeing here, this is what we're talking about. This is the specular reflection, like those highlights. Okay, we're not going to cover this today, but maybe for the sake of demonstration, let me show you. Or, okay, you don't have to worry about this, but let me show you because it's pretty interesting. Because the whole point here is that eventually we're going to be able to differentiate not only the color, but we're also going to be able to tell Maya, well, actually we want to differentiate this reflection. We don't want it to be as reflective in those little cavities, like in the little indents, like those little in the leather, right? So, and that's going to suddenly create a much more convincing result. So, without you having to worry too much about it, I'm just going to show you what I mean because it's pretty interesting. So, again, everything's going to happen in the same Photoshop document, so that's where we're going to be doing all the texturing. But here, what we're going to be doing the next time is I'm going to take all these layers. I can click and drag, and I can drag it down into the folder icon right there next to the create new layer icon. There's a folder icon. I can drag all those layers in there, and I can name this layer color. So, in here I'm working with my color map. But then I can just drag this whole folder into this new layer icon and make a copy of that folder. And here I can just rename. You can name it whatever, but just to keep organized. I can call this spec, and this is where I'll be creating a spec map. So, like I said, we'll look more into this next time, but very quickly, if I just do Control-Shift-U to desaturate it, Control-L to just do some levels, so let's just do something crazy here. This is just a black and white map with a lot of contrast. So we differentiate between, maybe I can even Control-I to invert it, so that now all the cavities will be darker. Maybe something like that. Anyways, you get the idea. It's just a black and white map. It's based on the color map, but we're just making a new black and white map. And then I'm going to save this as another PNG. So this will be chair spec. And then we'll go here, and in the material I need to go to now specular color. So there's one here in the hypershade, or here in the attribute editor. So in Maya, there's several ways of doing the same thing. But basically, in the material, under specular shading, there's specular color. I can go there and click. We'll select a new file node. And now we can see there's two connections going into the material. And again, I'm going to turn off the filter type, and I'll go and grab chair spec PNG. Now we should see this update. So right away, you can see that it changed. I don't know how successful that was, but you can see that we're breaking up the reflection, the specular highlights. To see that more clearly, I can disable the color and now only be working with the spec color. So you can see that it's subtle. It's very subtle, but that's actually what you want. You know, that kind of that level of detail where you're going and being very subtle about things. And this won't really be too evident in a still render always, but it's when you're moving around. It's like in a movie or a game, and you're interacting with the object, right? So when you the whole point here is this is now starting to get more into rendering and thinking about how light actually reflects off of the surface. So there's more going on than obviously just slapping on a color. And again, that's why I don't want you to just Google some reflective image and slap it on there. It's never going to look good. But I see people do that a lot when you're making metal. How can I make a metal? And then you put some horrible metal texture on there. No, that's not the way to do it. Don't worry about metals and making stuff like that look great for this class. This class is all about making the technically correct models, making sure you understand basic texturing. So why I'm showing you this now, so what to take away from this is that if you do a thorough job with the color map, then you have the basis for creating a spec map or a bump map. Okay, so but it's just like we don't take too many shortcuts. That's the point. You have to do a solid job first with the modeling, then you do a solid job with UV mapping, and then you do a really solid job working the color map. It's really this kind of way in CG where, you know, if you take too many shortcuts or early on, it will just mess up the process. So again, just devote yourselves a little bit to this creating the color map. So any questions about like technically how to go back and forth? So now I can obviously let's just forget about the spec map for now, but I can obviously do anything I want here. Let me add a new adjustment layer, for instance. So to the left of this little folder icon, we have adjustment layers, and then I can add a hue saturation. Adjustment layers will affect all underlying layers. So here I can change the hue. I can change the saturation. I can make it very saturated or desaturated. Okay. Well, let's take a short break. And to wrap up, I'm just going to briefly talk, give you some tips on how you can go about like painting, making it perhaps look a little bit more weathered or things like that. But just like take 5 minutes. We'll be back here a quarter to, and then we'll just spend like a short half hour wrapping things up. Okay. All right, so let's just wrap things up here. Just some quick notes on the tablet settings. You have two monitors, so on the at least the tablets you get at school, you know, the top 4 buttons. I don't know if you already know this. You can press the 4th button. You can toggle between the two monitors, like which monitor you're using, because you definitely don't want the tablet to be set up to be using both monitors at once. You need to be setting it to one of the monitors, and then just search for you know, Wacom tablet properties. So you'll get this box. So in mapping, just go to screen area and change it from full. Now it's using both, but yeah. So you can also change it here then. But set it to monitor, whichever monitor you're using. And also I like hitting force proportions. force proportions, it's going to make sure that your aspect ratio, you see, it's not using the full tablet, but that's preferable because now it's the aspect ratio is correct. So if I'm drawing a circle, I'm actually drawing a circle, not an egg. So it's actually pretty important. So I'm using monitor 2, force proportions, and I always turn off the Windows ink, but I can't now because I think I mentioned this, but new Photoshop has an issue with me turning off Windows ink on at least this current version of Photoshop and Windows. If I turn off Windows ink, the pressure sensitivity in Photoshop won't work. And I really need the pressure sensitivity to work. That's, most of the reason why you're using a tablet. So, but that's that little droplet that you see whenever I click the, it's just a stupid thing called Windows ink. So I wish they would just get rid of it, but it's there. So probably that will be fixed in the future patches or something. There is like a code patch you can manually go in there and do, but it will, yeah. So that's the only little annoyance that we have to live with at the moment. It's okay, not too bad. And then obviously just go to pen. So I was now doing all this in mapping. I can go to pen, just make sure that when I click the pen you can see that the pressure sensitivity is actually giving you that feedback. If you want to be using the pen also in Maya, you can set it up here so that this will be a middle click and a right click. So now we have a 3-button solution. So if I'm in Maya, I can navigate around using the pen. I don't really like using the pen too much. A lot of people in Maya, a lot of people do that. But I use obviously for ZBrush and Photoshop. The whole reason with using a tablet is that you have, well, a couple of reasons. You can just draw, but there's a learning curve because you have to get used to not looking down when you're drawing, but you're looking straight ahead into your monitor. So obviously that's a learning curve involved. But then you have pressure sensitivity, which is the whole point, because you don't have that on the mouse. You just have either you click or you don't. But here, if I make a new layer, if I activate these buttons up here, this is to, as you can say, always use pressure for opacity. That's and this is pressure for size. So if they're not turned on, the pressure sensitivity won't really take an effect. But if these buttons are turned on, if I apply a light pressure, I will have a lighter opacity. But if I apply a stronger pressure, it will be more opaque. So now I'm just drawing with a black color, but I can set to a gray color. So this is how you can start familiarizing yourself and getting used to working with the tablet. So now you can see also the size changed, but that was because this was set to also alter the size according to the pressure sensitivity. If that's off, I can still vary the opacity, but not the size. This will do that. Okay. So that's basically that. And then, but I wanted to show you just quickly for you to take note of this, and probably what you should do, what I encourage you to do, we won't have time to do, is just make some more reference search. So maybe search for weathered models. So weathering is just a term. A lot of you might have heard it. It also is used in well, it is a term that's technically used to talk about the way various surfaces deteriorate, right, over time. Different types of weathering. So it could be that the material has been exposed to friction, like we said, for instance, like in our case with the bar stool, we have to think about like where has this object been exposed to friction. So that's one thing that could happen, right? People sitting on the chair a lot would probably affect the surface over time. It could be exposed to weather, also friction in weather, like sand particles blown in the air, or if it's exposed to a lot of wind. Also light could make surfaces more faded. So typically you'd see that the paint or whatever kind of surface you had could be more faded off in certain areas. But in other areas, which would be more occluded from light, could be more preserved. So typically if you have occluded areas that are more protected from the elements, they could be more intact, like having more of that original look of the paint or the whatever material it is. So you have to start being a little bit analytical about this and I would start looking at some reference. Like these are pretty exaggerated results. If you just look at weathered models, a lot of them will be very old and worn and torn. Obviously, that's great. Like what I'm saying, it's a little bit challenging in this course if you're just making all of your surfaces brand new and you just say, well, none of them will have any sort of wear and tear because these are all brand new. And like, yes, you can always make that case, but you're not really showing texturing. I'm not saying you have to make it all weathered like crazy and old, but you should just take note of this, okay? So at least just go in and look at this. So this is a little bit more subtle, maybe, but still kind of weathered. Yeah, so we can spend more time and look at some reference and start being more analytical about it. But I encourage you to make this effort to actually sit down and look at some reference, but also just in real life start observing a little bit more of the surfaces around you, like in what ways do they not look brand new? Like how have they changed over time, and why? Start thinking a little bit more analytically about these things. Anyways, so that's always kind of inspiring to do. But the whole point here is this is not looking very weathered. I mean, it's very, very clean, you know. But I could have searched for references like weathered leather, and I would have had more a more varied texture. But I didn't do that, and there's something powerful about this approach. Rather, you would build this up manually, because now I can make it look more like this texture really belongs to the 3D object. So there are obviously several ways of doing this, but let me just show you a little tip. So let's say I want to make the leather surface a little bit more faded, like we're saying. Maybe perhaps in the middle here where, well, and then again we can go back to Maya and just like observe the UVs. So what are we actually looking at? So if I'm wondering where are these faces, I can just shift click and select the faces. I can see right here, and so let's say I want to make it more weathered in this area, so that I would need to concentrate right here in the UV layout. So this is how you can make sense of this and start navigating. Just select the faces. You see, okay, right there, these faces right here is where I need to be making it more weathered, and possibly also along the edges here. So this is a little bit challenging again. So depending on the way your UVs are laid out, these UVs are good. I mean, we have good UV shells. You know, these are for the most part pretty consistent UV shells. If you just clicked like automatic mapping in Maya or something, or you know, this is the whole point of taking the time to make paintable UVs. So you have UVs that make sense. You can go in there and actually at least make life a little bit easier in Photoshop. This is going to be a nightmare, obviously. If these faces would be all over the place, it would be very, very difficult to do this in Photoshop. But the point, it will be kind of time consuming. That's just the way it is. But anyways, so technically what I can do, I can copy this layer. So I played around with the hue saturation of this. Okay, I just changed it from that horrible yellow color and I made it something like this in the hue saturation adjustment layer. So I made adjustment layers are layers that you can apply different effects to that will affect all the underlying layers. So I just made a new hue saturation adjustment layer, and I click here in the adjustment layer and I just played around with the hue to change the actual color hue, and I turned down the saturation a bit. So made it a little bit less saturated, a little bit less intense color, right? So something like that, okay. And then if I'm happy with it and I just want to make a copy, I shift select all of them, including the adjustment layer, and I can just click and drag to copy them. So I drag them over there to the new layer icon, and then while they're still selected, I can hit Control E. That's to merge everything together, and then I have just a copy, which is just one layer. So then if I want to, I can even keep these. I don't have to delete them. In this Photoshop document, I can do what I want. So if I want to be able to iterate and go back and say, no, I'm not happy with it, let me change it, I can put all of these in another layer here, for instance. This is just going to call, be named work in progress or something like WIP, work in progress, and I can hide it. And I just have a lot of layers in there, but I'm not going to use them. Okay, fine. But here's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to copy the same layer. And this layer I'm going to play around with, well, you could do this in several ways, but what if we screen it? So you can see if I screen it, for instance, it's going to have this effect. So this is just overlaying this underlying layer. If I screen it, it's going to make it brighter. If I multiply it, it's going to make it darker. And then all these in between, you can try different things. These are just different interesting blending modes for you to try. But basically, multiply and all these associated blending modes will basically make it darker. Okay, just practically speaking. And then screen and all these associated ones will, in different ways, make it brighter. And then you can play with overlay, soft light. This is just aesthetically, you just have to look at it and see what am I trying to do. Or I could have even just not opted to use the blending modes necessarily, but let's just say Control L, and I just want to make it brighter. I can play around with the gamma. Control L to access the levels. Make it brighter like that. And this is the beauty of this. So now this is just a layer that's, oh, it's not really a huge change. Let me change, well, maybe it's okay. Let's try it. This is just the same layer, but I've just implemented a little bit of a change in the levels. But then I can make use of the layer mask. So I can right click, or just click here, where it says add layer mask. Now that's going to add another layer within the layer. It's just a black and white layer. And this decides what is visible in this layer. If it's all white, it just means it's all visible. If it's all black, let me just select the pitch black color, and I'll go to the bucket tool, and I'll fill that. So you need to make sure you're selecting, you're using the cursor, and you're just selecting, and you're on that layer mask. So if I fill the layer mask with black, it just means that now this layer is currently not visible at all. But this is the whole point with this, is now I can start painting. So let me now select the white color. So I'm in this mask, and I'm start painting with white. You can see that I can just add gradually wherever I want that layer to be. And I'm just updating the layer mask. So this is a pretty powerful way of working because it's completely non-destructive, meaning I can just change my mind and I can keep iterating, which is pretty important to be able to do. Because if I just, again, select a black color, if you have white and black selected, okay, so to alter between the two colors, you can hit X. That's to alter between the primary and the secondary color. So if you want to do that a couple times so that you can select the primary and the secondary color, and then you can keep going with this. Whenever I hit X, I can just keep, I'm adding or I'm removing. So white or black, you just keep adding or removing. And then I can, whenever I want to change this layer, I can just go back to this layer and click Control L. Let's say now I want to adjust the levels a little bit more. But you can see what I'm doing there. Okay, but this is without the blending mode. Let's not try to actually use the blending mode that I talked about. Let's screen it up on top of there. Okay, that's pretty intense. So let me delete all of this. Let me try it again. So this is what, this is more experimentation is needed for this. Okay, there are so many different scenarios. This is more aesthetically, you have to keep working this, but I'm making an image, a layer mask. I'm filling it with a black color again, but now it's just a different person. I'm just using screen blend mode. And then starting to paint with white in the layer mask. So it's very important to be on the layer mask, because if you just start painting white on the layer, it's obviously just going to add white color to the layer, which is, well, you don't want that. So, you know, I could spend more time, navigate very carefully in Maya, and make sure I know exactly which faces I'm looking at, but it was in this general area. But see, that becomes very, very powerful. So if I turn off the, you see what I'm doing? All I'm doing is like I'm adding this little interest here. I can also play around with the general opacity. It's like if I don't want that much of an effect of it, maybe just like that. Okay, but that's all I'm doing. But then let's just do something else. Let's just quickly go over and also do the same. Like if you look at the model again, like, okay, so I'm imagining that wherever there's been a lot of people sitting, you know, if the surface has been a little bit weathered, it's a little bit old, then probably the areas where people have been sitting would be somewhat faded, and also the areas that's been exposed to a lot of friction, which would be the corners. So I'd probably do the same for the corners. Just go over and introduce some differentiation. So I'm going to just use the same layer here and simply use the UV layout as a guide and start painting in some white color in the layer mask along the edges here. So this is how you can gradually take something that's just a flat texture and you start making it look like it belongs to the geometrical shape. And that's how we're going to make this a little bit more believable. So manually adding that level of that weather instead of relying on a predefined texture that would be weathered leather, for instance. Anyways, so I do want to keep all of these in layers because like when we're doing the spec map next time and also the bump map, it's helpful to be able to go back to the result without this, like to just generate the bump map. This will become more clear next time, but the bump map is generally like essentially a map that's black and white with a lot of gray scales in between that we'll be able to simulate all these little bumps in the leather. We can actually make it look like they go into the surface. So in the render, it will actually look like it's tiny little surface detail. But then we can't have this bright color covering. This is also another really important point why it's worthwhile building up the textures like these in a more manual way, because it's much easier to generate something like a bump map, right? So that will become pretty clear next time. Anyways, so like let's just see how that looks, you know. But this is how you'd have to spend time with this. It's not like, I think texturing is probably even more time consuming. Like if you really want that look. So I can just save over this PNG, right? You want to replace it? Yes. Okay. Then back to Maya. So if you have the Hypershade open on the other monitor and just right-click on the file node, come on, and then reload image file. So then that the path is set correctly. So it's gonna update that on the fly. So now we don't have the spec map, but you can imagine that also in the areas where the leather has been more worn. This is again topic for next time, but if you do the job again, make the effort in the color map, that's where the interest is, and then you can have fun with making a spec map. When you say that, well, in all the worn areas, the specular highlights will actually be less reflective, so it will be more of a diffuse kind of a reflection. So let's quickly try to do that. Well, let's very quickly try to do that because we're pretty much done. But I'm just going to copy this and Control E. Quickly, just to show you what I mean, Control-Shift-U to desaturate, and then just use Control-L and just introduce more contrast, and then Control I to invert, because I want actually the opposite effect. I want this to be less specular, so that needs to be darker. Let's just exaggerate a little bit so you see what I mean. And then save this as a PNG. And this will be chair spec, and I'm just gonna, you want to replace it? Yes, okay. And then also make sure, remember to save the actual PSD document. This is where you're working. Okay, and back to Maya. So I'm gonna now go to the chair material, and again, under specular color, attach the file node. This is what we'll be doing next time. But, you know, this is just sort of making the spec maps and the bump maps. If you don't have a solid color map, if you don't have that information there, you know, really, it's not going to do much for you. So, okay, so then we added the spec map. So I can turn off the color. I can just, if I select this connection, I can just delete that connection temporarily. So now we're only looking at the spec map. So it's not only the specular color, though. You can play around with the other attributes that has to do with specular shading. So alright, so I think I'm gonna generally make it so that there's much more of a differentiation right now, just to show you the point, between this dark area and all the other areas. So that's why it's, again, it's but we'll get more into this next time. But that's, again, why it's helpful to have this separated, because I have this layer mask. If I control-click the layer mask, I'll actually select that selection, and I can just fill the selection. Let's see, Control Backspace with color. So very quickly I can make this very exaggerated result, which would have been very hard to do in another way. Anyways, just to show you that it is really worthwhile building these maps. Taking the time with the color map. But anyways, let's just make some sort of exaggerated difference. Blur this a little bit. And maybe we'll multiply. So this would be PNG spec. And reload image file. Hello. Oh, I can also do it here. So it's kind of hard to see, but you can sort of see when I go like that, the specular reflection is less in this area that's more worn. It'll be more clear if the color is darker. Alt-B, I can change the background color if I want to make it black. Control space for full screen. So this is sort of what we're starting to do. We're starting to think about the way light interacts with the surface, right? The surface response. So we're thinking about, okay, if it's more weathered, it's more worn, that the shininess and the gloss in the leather would be less. Anyways, so excellent. But that's basically technically how you can go about this, and it would take a lot of time, just like anything. So don't worry too much about the spec map, but just build these. Okay, and then final point. Same thing. It's just that the opposite would be true. Like if we're making indents, or if we want to make areas of the textures that's darker, I can copy this layer again. I put it on top. But this time, instead of using screen, I can use multiply, for instance. And then, or, let's see. Let's multiply it, but then I'll desaturate this level, or this layer a little bit. You know, you play around with the blending modes. So now I can make it darker in areas, and I can also apply a layer mask for this. And then fill that layer mask with black to make it go away, and then gradually start painting in white wherever I want this surface to be darker. Right. I hope that makes sense technically. You just have to try it. Start getting used to also Photoshop for those of you who are not too familiar with it. But you can see I can make these surface variations manually, making it belong more, feels like it belongs more to the geometrical shape. And it's completely non-destructive. That's what we want. Okay, that's it for the texturing part. So if you do have some more questions and regarding UV mapping or anything that you're unsure about, because actually we didn't really have time to talk about the tileable textures. Let me talk about that for 2 minutes. Literally 2 minutes. It's pretty simple for our intents and purposes. But if I have a plane, if you have very large surfaces, this is why I recommend you, if you're still kind of unsure about UVs, you should show up at 3:30, okay? Because, for instance, if you're texturing very, very large surface areas, one thing is for your kitchen scenes, like I saw a lot of your scenes, you want to make sure that you're not just building everything in one huge block. You know, there are maybe a lot of the same repeating elements, should ideally be sharing some textures, you know, making things optimized. And also, if you're texturing very large areas, it's useful to use tileable textures probably, instead of going in there and applying a very, very huge texture. It's kind of a side note right now, but if I make a blend, if you do a search on textures.com for anything, or even just online in general, a lot of the texture references you'll see are actually what you call tileable textures. It means that they can be repeated without us noticing it. They're created in that way. We can create our own tileable textures. It's not too tricky to do in Photoshop. And just download some of these. So these are, yeah, it says so it's called seamless or tileable. So a lot of the texture references you'll find are actually constructed that way. I would recommend you stick with 1-to-1 image ratios. Right. So a quick note on that. Like we've discussed that before. Like 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096. I would recommend sticking to those resolutions. Right. See if I have some in here. This says tile. Let me try to open that in Photoshop. Okay, so in Photoshop, there's a nice little way to check if this is a tileable texture. So this, I just had this on the server, right? So I've already downloaded it. If you go to Filter, Other, Offset, this will actually offset the corners of the image. So you're just moving the sides of the image into the image itself. Whoops, wrong button. Offset. So you can see horizontal offset So I'm moving the sides of the image around. Vertical offset. Okay, so it's not really tileable. It's tileable in the horizontal direction, but not really in the vertical. So, well, that gives me an opportunity to quickly show you how you can try to make tileable textures. If I copy that layer, click V to move, and shift, and I just move that layer up a little bit more. Let's try to. If I just have this layer on top right, so I can quickly go in and erase part of that layer. So, I mean, that's one way you can go about this and start building up your own tileable textures. So I'm trying to get rid of that seam. So now see that it's kind of disappearing. Just making that layer on top of the other layer. Alright, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you get the idea. For the most part, you will probably be building hero assets like the chair. That's what I want you to do for the most part. But anyway, so now I do this and I can control E. Now that's just one layer again. And then I start using offset. So eventually when you do this process, you'll eventually see that you can't really see the seams anymore. And that's how you know that you now have a tileable texture. Okay. So then I can save this file. Let me just put it in the same directory. Just put it directly in the source images. So this is a TIFF. Let me save it as a PNG just for it to be a little faster. So wood plank tile. Yeah, fine. Save. So what was the resolution on that? Image size in pixels. 1024. So that's a 1K little tile. No. Not too little, but it's fine. Okay, so in this blend, again, we're just attaching the file node, turning off the filter type. Same procedure, just finding the color. Now that's obviously just tiled once, just because the plane here already has UVs, right? So this is just filling the 0 to 1. But then we can tile it. And that's when we're going to look at the other little node here that we saw. So this is the new material. So let me graph input connections on it. This would be the floor. I can rename it. I can double click it. This would be floor material. And then this time we're going to go into the place 2D texture node and look at the repeat UVs. That's it. So we're just repeating the UVs. So let's say 10 times, 10 by 10. The whole purpose, of course, is that we don't have to. Yeah, so you can see that if in some cases it's much more evident than others. So in this case, see, it's not working too great because that's the way the texture is. It's kind of revealing itself to be tileable. Oops, or that it is tiling. But you can see that it's much more efficient because, well, where's the tile there? That's in my texture somewhere, or not. Oh, it doesn't appear to be. Yeah, but that's the basics of tileable textures. So if you have very large surfaces, you probably want to opt for that, like in your kitchen scene, instead of applying. Like, you can also, yeah, a little too big topic, but you need to make sure that you're, again, the textile density, right? So you just have to make a little calculation, like, so how large is your texture tile? In my case, I'm using a 1K tile, and I'm tiling it like, what, 6 times. So the total image resolution would be, for this plane, would be 1K times 6, right? That would be the total image resolution. So you just need to make sure that it's not too low res to exist in the same scene as your other assets, right? Simply put, if you have very large surfaces, don't make a huge UV for this and just slap on like a huge 8K texture, which you would need to do in order to make that huge surface have the same image resolution, right? Or the same texel density. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about this for those of you who are interested. If you want to show up at 3:30, you can. We'll answer some more issues or questions you have regarding UV mapping. And then you will have, like I said, until November 1st to deliver the report regarding the reflection paper on UV mapping. All right. So, final questions? We're doing good? Think it'll be all right? Okay. So just make sure you spend time on the color map, and then next time, it's really just we'll look at bump map, spec map, transparency, how you can do that, and maybe also like a glow map. But once you understand Photoshop and you really understand how to go like back and forth between Maya and Photoshop, then you will grasp next session. It's a little bit technical the way you build up the maps, but you really want to make sure that you experiment with the blending modes and the layer masks, and just generally spend time in Photoshop, right? That's what you want to be doing. Try this approach that I'm showing you, how you can build this up manually using blending modes, layer masks, all of that. And then it's going to be easier for you next time. Right. Okay, great. So I'll see some of you at 3:30 if you want to show up. Thank you.